Jacob Rees-Mogg, who joins us from Westminster. Mr. Rees-Mogg, thank you for being with us. What do you think of the possibility of extending this transition period by less than a year?
I think it's a poorly thought through idea that it takes us into the next multi-annual financial framework, and that raises the issue of there being very substantial costs, because the next framework will be determined without our veto, and therefore it's unlikely that we would maintain our rebate. So it could be a very expensive thing to do. It's unknown as to whether this had approval from the Cabinet when it met earlier in the week to make this proposition. But it also doesn't solve the issue of the backstop, because the backstop would remain, as far as one can tell, at the end of this additional transition. So it seems to me to be a rather poor attempt at kicking the can down the road.
I mean, the argument, and we're not sure whether it was Mrs. May who proposed it or the European Union 27 side, the argument is there's a lot of things to sort out, future trade relationship and also the Irish backstop, and this would put off the Irish backstop coming in and increase the chances of agreeing a trade deal, which would mean the backstop would become an irrelevance.
Well, the issues have all been known for a considerable amount of time, and these are issues that could have been discussed earlier on in the negotiations. And so it's hard to see why an extra few months would make any great difference to that, and it would still leave potentially a backstop if they didn't manage to do it within this even longer period of time. But it means we're in the European Union for longer, when the EU can make rules for the United Kingdom over which we would have no say, and we would be paying for the privilege. Now, the government doesn't have endless money. It has to make choices. And the question the government has to answer is, if this cost billions of pounds, is it better to give the money to the European Union, or is it better to sort out the issues with the universal credit? I would prefer the money was spent ensuring the universal credit worked.
Again, I suppose the counter-argument would be it wouldn't just be money going into the European Union, but we would continue to have the benefits of the single market, which British business certainly wants to keep going as long as possible.
Well, we would be paying in. We're significant net contributors, and the benefits of the single market are highly debatable. It's a very regulatory system that creates inefficiencies, and we would also maintain the very high tariffs on products coming in from outside the European Union that make food, clothing and footwear in particular more expensive for British consumers. So there are significant downsides to extending transition in terms of how well off the nation would be.
So do you think there just needs to be a complete rethink in the British government approach to these negotiations?
Well, we need to look at what the EU has offered us. Donald Tusk has offered and reiterated the offer of a Canada plus trade deal, the best trade deal the EU has ever done, which would be good for business and for which we wouldn't have to pay in billions of pounds. He's only offered it for Great Britain, not for the whole of the United Kingdom. We need to focus on the issues around the Irish border, how we can meet those in accordance with the needs of the European Union, to maintain the integrity of the single market, to recognise that's a serious worry for the European Union. And the ERG came up with proposals as to how that could be done based on existing EU precedent at its borders in other parts of the world. So that's the challenge for the government, rather than an endless transition and never coming to any clear decision. And I'm afraid this is an example of a failure to decide things.
Are you attracted to Nick Boles' idea, I've just been speaking to him, of having a sort of transition through the European economic area?
Nick Boles is a highly intelligent and thoughtful politician, and his ideas are always worth considering seriously. I think there are some issues with the EEA and EFTA proposal, particularly relating to continuing freedom of movement, and I'm not entirely sure why an EFTA proposition would be better than the 21-month transition currently proposed, but I agree with him that the end state is a super Canada situation.
The problem with what you would like, which is so-called Canada Plus, is that the EU is quite clear that as far as trade between Britain and the EU are concerned, that it would be less flexible, that there would be costs both to business and to consumers. So while it might open us up to the rest of the world, the EU is the biggest trading bloc we have at the moment. What's the advantage to the British public in that idea?
But it's very hard to see where the costs would be to consumers. We'd have lower prices for consumers because we wouldn't have to charge the very
we'd
high
have tariffs
EU...
for a start, potentially, with European goods.
Why would we? That would be a matter for us to decide. What sort of government would decide to put tariffs on food, clothing and footwear coming into this country from the European Union? You're suggesting things that are just politically unrealistic, that no sensible, even an idiotic government wouldn't make food, clothing and footwear more expensive coming from the European Union. There's no hit to consumers. I'm afraid what you're saying is characteristic.
I mean, the point is Canada doesn't have a tariff-free relationship with the European Union. You want a Canada-style deal.
But you're...
that follows. And what about the
obstruction
to businesses?
No, Donald Tusk has offered us tariff and quota-free access to the European market under the best free trade deal the EU has ever done. So there isn't a cost to consumers. There will be difference, of course there will, because we'll be out of the European Union. That's the key point. You can't have everything the same as being in the European Union when you've left. That's fantasy land. That's the magical thinking that people like Michel Barnier have talked about. There will be differences, but the advantages are we have lower costs from the rest of the world, and we will not unilaterally increase cost on goods coming from the European Union, because that would be folly.
But the differences are disadvantages for business, particularly with just-in-time manufacturing, for example.
Well, that's simply wrong. That's not true. Hold on for a moment. I asked the head of HMRC yesterday, could just-in-time delivery take place from outside the European Union? He gave a single-word answer, yes. Just-in-time delivery is not something that only happens within the European Union. It happens globally.
But it happens subject to agreements, and what you're proposing is a specific agreement.
No, that's not actually true. Just-in-time delivery doesn't happen subject to agreements. It happens because businesses buy from other businesses. Just-in-time delivery can happen with customs checks. It's merely a question of knowing the timings. Delays on the M25 are a greater problem for just-in-time delivery than delays coming through the port at Southampton for non-EU exporters.
What about what Dominic Raab's been saying about the meaningful vote? Do you support him on that it should just be something which can't be amended and should just be accept the deal or hard Brexit?
Well, I think that's absolutely right in terms of parliamentary procedures. I don't see that anything else has ever been the case.
OK, Jacob Rees Mogg, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Pleasure.